Hey everybody, we are going to begin with a quick announcement from... Are
you talking to us?
Yeah, I'll talk in a second.
Is it important?
It will be when he starts talking.
Okay.
All right, good morning. Good morning. Good to have everybody here. If we can, we're going to start with a quick administrative announcement, and then we'll get into the material shortly thereafter.
Good morning. My name is Noah Smith. If you didn't catch me in the first week, first, just want to thank you for coming out to this resurrection class the last 4 weeks. I was not able to come last week because I was out for my anniversary, but it was a great time. But I'm sure you guys benefited. First of all, obviously, this is giving you a slight introduction to solid ground ministry. So if you've never come here before and you really like the type of discussion that we have here, please continue to come. It's here at the same time in the same room each week, and Scott, is the same Scott each week. So, but I do want to, on a slightly different vein, just let you know about two other classes that we have started, not next Sunday, but the following Sunday, the 8th. We have two other classes, Equipping the Saints classes, and this has been a partnership with Solid Ground Ministry and Equipping the Saints Ministry for this class, but these other classes are structured slightly differently. The first one is an in-depth study on the book of Philippians, so it's a 4-week study. We're going to go through, it's really a deep dive, cultural, historical background. We're going to look at we're going to look at each verse, basically, not individually, but we're going to go verse by verse and try to drive the meaning out of the text and look at main themes, look at all different kinds of things that you would find in like a commentary of Philippians. So it's really in depth. If you have any questions, please ask me afterwards. Another class, though, that's starting the same Sunday, which is 8 weeks. I would recommend to everybody, if you've never taken it, it's called Firm Foundations. And really, if you call RBC your home and you haven't taken this class, no matter where you are on I've been a Christian for 30 years or 2 weeks, really, if this is your church home, this class, Firm Foundations, goes through our doctrinal statement. It's kind of a systematic theology kind of class. But if you haven't gone through it, I would recommend it because if this is your church, then you probably should know what we confess as a church. What are the core doctrines that we believe as a church? Because that should be important wherever you go to church. So that is an 8-week class, also starting on the 8th. So both of those classes, if you have any questions, please ask me. But there are more of these flyers that I put out on the table that we had these first classes on. It's just on the flip side. And you can sign up through the QR code or online. So just wanted to let you guys know about those. Yeah.
What time are the classes?
Good question. So the Philippians class is at the 9 o'clock.
So
I'm competing with Scott. Yeah. So if your brain is a little tired from the rigor of a solid ground class, and you want a reprisal in the book of Philippians and be refreshed, although we are going to dive deep into it, then please. It is a 4-week class, so Scott's classes go every week. So I don't want to compete, but yeah, competing. The second one though is at the 10:45 for the 8-week class. So. Yeah, thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to jump into the material today. So we're going to start. This is in the back of the book for those of you that have the hard copy or the electronic copy. And we're going to I'm going to say briefly through the detailed outline of the arguments. Why are we going to do this? So obviously in a 4-week class where a lot of what we're trying to do is contextualize or help you understand how it is that you make decisions about things that you believe in your life, you can't go through a book this long in great detail. However, the authors have done something that honestly is very rare, and if you don't appreciate it yet, hopefully you'll appreciate it after this class. But for someone to go through their own book and outline the arguments that are contained in the book it's very uncommon, but very helpful. And then you can obviously take the skeleton of that outline and go see how well it's evidenced by referring back to the chapters that deal with the material in a greater level of detail. However, the outline alone is 30 pages long, so we can't cover it in depth even in this class. which is hopefully if you're wondering, why, hey, Scott, we've got a book. Can you just teach the book? No, not in 4 weeks, okay? Like any class, you have to do the work, and the work at home is read the book so that you have an understanding, and when we talk about the rest of the stuff in it, it makes sense to you. We will do the best that we can of giving the Cliff Notes version of it in this class right here. But why did I haze everybody in the classroom with 3 weeks of philosophy talk and probability theory? If you got nothing else from it at all, understand this. Most people, 95+%, never ask themselves the question, why am I trusting the things that I trust? Why do I believe the things that I believe? And the method that you use to do so is the fancy word I talked about, epistemology. And if you don't understand the method that you're using, if you don't understand what standards you have, and you don't understand what ruler you have, then guess what happens? You get whatever result you already wanted. So solid ground is about something that feels scary, but in the long run helps a lot. It feels scary because what you say is, okay, I'm going to measure stuff and it may not come out the way that I want. I might be wrong. And that's scary. But as a guy who's done this for a few decades now, what I can tell you is this. If you'll just be honest with yourself, stop clutching on to what it is that you've believed, and instead say, I'm going to honestly evaluate it and use the same metric that everybody uses when they're thinking well, you'll find out that Christianity will measure up better than any other worldview out there by a lot. So it's scary, but it turns out to work well. And that's the point I want to get to. We will go more into that in the following weeks. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to contextualize this information, how we make those kinds of decisions. In short, how do you does your faith have to be blind, or can it be well evidenced? If there's for those who've been in solid ground for a while, raise your hands. So genuine question on your part, based on what we've done in solid ground, do you believe that your faith is very well evidenced? Raise your hand if you think so. Okay, and we've done these kinds of discussions and asked these kinds of questions for a long time. So it does in fact increase your faith to find out how much your faith is actually supported. So what's the standard we're using here? Anybody remember, broadly speaking, in terms of scientific standards, in terms of philosophical standards or historical standards, what's the standard we're using when we evaluate this question of the historicity of Jesus' resurrection? Yes, that's the approach we're going to use. That is absolutely the approach we're going to use. What type of ruler are we using? A historical one, which is not the same as a scientific measurement. It is not the same as a proof measurement from mathematics. This is, in short, we're asking the question, I believe facts about history. Why do I believe facts about history? What's my standard? What is my metric? This is a claimed fact about history. I have to use, if I'm going to be fair, the same standard and metric. Okay. So keeping that in mind, that was 3 weeks summarized in 2 minutes. Let's look at this information here. Some of it I'm going to skip past. Some of it I'm going to cover in a little more detail, depending on where I think it enriches it by some of the data that are in here. But at any point, if someone wants to stop and talk about another one of these bullet points, raise your hand and let's do it. Okay, so a little bit on the introductory information. This is at the beginning of the appendix. A note on the importance of Jesus' resurrection. I would skip down to 1D here and say, if it didn't occur, Christianity is false. Like that's basically the easy one right there. So, however, if it doesn't occur, what does that mean? What should everybody in this room who believes this stuff then believe, probably? What religion would you be? Judaism, probably, right? So you probably already believe a lot of the stuff that's in the Old Testament. If you still believe the Old Testament, if that hasn't been disproven to you, but the resurrection is disproven, then you're no longer a Christian. You're probably a Jew, religiously, okay? Or if you're like, no, I've ignored the whole Old Testament fairly wholesale the whole time. It's only an entree to the resurrection, then maybe you are then you're agnostic at this point. Okay. This is an important point right here. If it's the case that there are good reasons to believe the resurrection, it validates what Jesus taught. Because Jesus taught some very controversial things. And from one of the notes that you'll hear a lot of people who are listening to him, as recorded in the Gospels, are They were astonished at what?
His wisdom, his teaching.
The way he was taught.
The way he taught, which was what? Yeah, like he said, it says specifically, did not teach like their scribes and scholars, but one who the authority belonged with him. Because the scholars were saying, this comes from the Lord, or this comes from Moses, and Jesus is saying, you may have heard this, but I'm telling you this. That's an authority pronouncing. That's not somebody just referring to a higher authority. Okay. And if the resurrection did occur, then you have good reasons to believe in Christian doctrine and the truth of Christianity writ large, so to speak. That's to say, if somebody says, I'm going to do this amazing miracle, and everybody's like, yeah, right, you're not telling the truth. And then an amazing miracle occurs, you probably ought to adjust your priors, as we've been talking about, and listen to the person a little bit more. Same thing goes in the scientific world. Hey, here's this new scientific theory. It's revolutionary. No, you don't know what you're talking about. That's wrong. Proves out to be right. Hey, maybe we should listen to this Einstein guy or something like that. Okay. Looking at B, there are 4 reasons that support the likelihood that Jesus predicted his resurrection. So this is an important fact. Did he predict it? 1, the predictions are denied because the resurrection itself is denied. However, if the resurrection occurred, the reason for rejecting Jesus predicting fails. So this is an attempt to show that objection works the other way. The Gospels provide, this is a very important point from a historian's perspective. So when historians are making assessments of whether or not something is true, it is not unusual for kings or historians, the winners write the history books, to write facts that make them look good in history or that make their claims seem more plausible. When the historian records something that is embarrassing, in fact, you'll hear it, you've read it in here as the criterion of embarrassment. When a historian records something embarrassing, it usually is considered a truth indicator by historians. Like they normally wouldn't want to record this, but they did. This isn't the best way to do this, but they said it anyway. And things like the way the disciples acted, which is highly embarrassing to all the disciples, right? If you're trying to build yourself up to be the foundation of a new world religion, and you're like, I was a traitor. Well, I was a coward. Well, we were all cowards. It doesn't bode well for you. Oh, well, who evidenced this stuff? Obviously, solid evidence. Yeah, these ladies over here were the ones that said it. Wait a second, we don't trust ladies' testimony. That was certainly the way that they operated back in the day. And it wasn't just Jewish culture. It was fairly world spread. Not everywhere, but most places. Okay, so this is called the principle of embarrassment, and it's considered a marker of authenticity by historians in all other cases as well. This is interesting. If you didn't read deeply in the book, you might have missed this point. But point 3, Jesus uses the title "the Son of Man" a lot when he refers to himself. So if the authors are making something up and they're trying to tee up a rising Messiah, you wouldn't have him constantly saying he's the Son of Man, because when you go back and look in the Old Testament, there's the idea of the Son of Man doesn't in any way really suggest that this is a dying and rising Messiah, right? That would be an unusual interpretation of the references to the Son of Man. So there are suffering servant metaphors out there and analogies, but they are not linked to the Son of Man. Okay, obviously number 4, from a historical perspective, a forensic perspective maybe, that his predictions concerning his resurrection are multiply attested. So you have multiple sources, including independent ones. So for those that are kind of into the scholarship side, you'll note that there are often cited Q document, which seems to form a lot of the base oral tradition and ultimately then written tradition, off of which Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written, because a lot of the material in there is word for word similar. And so that indicates that they were working off of a common base document. John does not have that format, so even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke are still considered independent sources in virtue of the fact that they have additional material in each one that is not contained in the common material, John is basically written from zero, you can say. Okay, so C is very important. That's why they put it in italics. So listen carefully or read this one carefully. What is it that we're doing here? So I asked what the measurement was, and she said minimal facts approach. That's right in one form, in that what we're doing is saying we're not going to use any kind of religious reasoning, nor in fact are we going to use what's considered fringe or controversial data. So that's very, very important. We're not going to use religious reasoning. We're not going to use fringe data. We're only going to use what scholarship says are the agreed upon facts, historically speaking. Then what these guys are going to do is say, if those are the accepted facts, what's the best explanation of those facts? And let me scene set one more time here. When you're looking for a good explanation has to do at least two things. One, obviously it has to, in some way, cogently explain what's going on. Like it's an obvious logical link between this is what was claimed to have happened and this is why it happened or why we think that it happened. The other thing that's important is when you're considering multiple hypotheses, which historians always have to do, which we always have to do. Could be the case that this actually happened. Could be the case these guys hallucinated. Could be the case somebody stole the body and made it all up from zero. There's all those explanations out there. When you have facts and evidence, you have to say, here are all these facts. This hypothesis of somebody stole the body, which fact does it explain? Does it explain all of them, or does it explain one of them? Well, it explains one of them really well. Okay, what about these other facts? Well, the other facts are at variance with this hypothesis. So a good hypothesis fits all the facts. So here's a hypothesis. It fits fact one. It fits fact two. It's an explanation of fact three. It's an explanation of fact four. And it's an explanation of fact five. This is the heart of this argument. It says, yes, there are many objections elsewhere. None of them explain, and this is called in history, explanatory power. None of them explain all the facts, as well as the hypothesis that Jesus actually rose from the dead. That one fits all five facts completely. All the other explanations do an adequate job of explaining one or two or three of the facts, but when you put all five of them there, they don't explain them all, which is why the authors will say, as a historian, you should prefer the Jesus rose from the dead hypothesis because it has greater explanatory power. It matches all the facts, it uses accepted data, and it has the greatest explanatory power. That's, in a nutshell, what this argument is saying. Okay. Arguments for Jesus' resurrection. So the disciples, one of the key factors, maybe in my opinion the most key factor, is the disciples sincerely believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Now, if it's the case that they were wrong about that, which is possible, obviously that's not, the fact that the disciples believed it isn't an argument that it's actually true. What that disciples believed it is going to go on to prove is something else, okay? And so hold that in mind. External evidence and events support the authenticity of their belief in his resurrection, the conversion of the church prosecutor Paul and the conversion of the skeptic James, his brother, and the empty tomb. Now here's the point I was making earlier, stated more succinctly. Since no plausible opposing theories exist that can account for the historical facts, and by that I mean all of them, Jesus' resurrection is the only plausible explanation. Now notice that this is an argument from a logical argument from a historian's standards perspective. This is not a religious argument. This is a scholar's argument right here. So when people say to you, Christians just believe things on faith, not this argument. This argument specifically says we don't take any of this on faith. We're going to use historical scholarship and then ask the question, what does the evidence support? Okay, now we jump into the facts themselves. And you'll see yes, sir.
So I'm just thinking about all this and thinking about our current culture, and I think people are so much into how much we get news today and how much we get history, and they go, hey, how do we not know somebody just wrote 100 years ago and said, I'm going to put this theory together that you got here, and then write a book that then supports that theory. Right?
Yes.
That's the whole embarrassing part about this. And it's just, and I'm not saying that's an easily plausible idea, but I can see our culture and people just being lazy and just saying, well, they probably just wrote this all up and made up this whole theory. And how do I know this Bible's really close to 2,000 years old in the first place?
Yes, that's right.
So it's, I think what I'm not seeing here is the veracity or the proof that these words were written a long time ago, and they weren't written a few hundred years ago.
Okay, so these will get into that, but if you, for those who've read the book, what's the quick answer to that question?
Is he using alternative sources, not just the Bible?
Multiple independent attestation, and not just the Gospels and the New Testament. What else?
Well, it's also the scholarly consensus that the books, the biblical books, testimonies were written not 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but very, very long time ago. There's some discussion between them, but obviously not within the last.
Yeah, and one of these arguments will get into some depth. So what historians will do is they'll turn around and what historians are normally forced to do is, especially for ancient sources, is turn around and say, what's the most recent data I have? And oftentimes the answer is like, it's this copy that I have from the Middle Ages of something that, Plutarch's Lives or of something like that, right? And the most recent copy you have is 1,000 years after the event. Has anybody seen the fragments of the Gospel of John that are been in the museum in Dublin for a long time? It's from dates to between 90 and 100 AD. Okay, so within 70 years of this stuff purportedly happening. And it word for word matches the copies that we have in the Middle Ages kind of thing. So the historians try to track back not just when the most recent one was written, but where did they get it, so to speak. So all the stuff that we talk about, the Q document, nobody has Q, right? Q is just the common material between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, but do you see why it's reasonable to assume that Q exists? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're using word for word some of the same material. There is an explanation. It's like, well, God talked to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mostly the same, exactly, for portions of it. Then he gave them some other stuff. Or alternately, no, that was what they were working off of, was a common document that recorded it like eyewitnesses would, kind of thing. Yes, Steve?
I think that they were trying to say is that there's this oral tradition.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, is when they say, whereas Q is obviously the source of some of the material for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, oral tradition is the source for a lot of this stuff as well. Why? Because that's how it's always done. If you even think about modern history, that's how it's done. When Bob Woodward goes out and writes a book about the Department of Defense or something like that, he writes a book based on oral tradition. He sits down with people who are like, yeah, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Ronald Reagan told Oliver North to do X, Y, and Z, right? He's not necessarily going back to documentary evidence that's saying that. He's coming back to witness attestation that says this is what happened. And he puts it together and he writes a book that we consider to be historically relevant. And they'll have quotations in it from 15 years ago. Those guys remember those quotes exactly? 15 years ago. I remember that this guy said to me, blah, 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 blah. Is that word for word perfect? But we certainly treat it like it's accurate. So that's the same thing going on here. And to Steve's point, the oral traditions that are responsible, you will see this in a couple of these arguments here, go back to within a handful of years from when Jesus supposedly was crucified and rose from the dead. So an excellent question, but let's look through a couple of these arguments, because they will answer that question in greater detail too. Okay, so the facts, they refer to them as in 4+1. You'll see them say that, which are 4 really well-attested facts and one that's reasonably well-attested. Okay, death by crucifixion is reported in all 4 Gospels. And remember, we're assuming the Gospels are just books in history like any other book in history, nothing special about them. Reported by a number of non-Christian sources, so Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Marabar Serapion also mention Jesus' crucifixion. Did I just do that? Right, there we go. Okay. Now, to the disciples' belief that he rose from the dead, not it is that he did rise from the dead, but their belief that he rose from the dead. They claimed it, and the abbreviation they use for this is POW. Paul, oral tradition, and the last one is written tradition. So Paul is an important factor here from a historian's perspective. Why is Paul an important factor from a historian's perspective?
He did a lot of the writing.
He did a lot of the writing, but as a test, as why is Paul a particularly interesting witness? Yeah, and let's call him an antagonist of the highest order, right? He's killing guys on the other side, okay? And he's got good motivations, all kinds of good motivations not to believe this. He's rising in power. He's been given extraordinary power. He's probably well accepted and reinforced by his peers as a result. So, Paul's got good reason to hold on to the idea that Jesus is a false Messiah. So now, what does Paul say? Well, Paul say the disciples claim Jesus rose. This is very important to Steve's point and to your point of how far back does this go. Paul's attestation, which we historians will say much of what Paul wrote is earlier material than the gospel material. So one of the reasons we're focused on Paul's material is that in terms of who wrote it down first, Paul's the one who wrote some of the stuff down earlier, much of the stuff down earlier than other people did. So he's one who says, yeah, this was the story from the get-go, that Jesus died and rose again. His authority, he's claiming to be authoritative. So Paul's not turning around and saying, I only got it from these guys. He says, this is what I received. But then he also goes in a couple of these locations and says, it's not just it got handed to me. I met the risen Christ myself. So Paul's making a claim that he was an eyewitness to this too. And then it's acknowledged by the apostolic fathers. So this is important in the, how do we know if it accreted legendarily? Well, all these initial guys who were, let's call them second wave fathers, not the initial disciples, but the disciples of the disciples and the disciples of the disciples of the disciples, all have the same data. And when stuff gets legendarily accreted, there's variance in the data. But they've all attested to the same concept here, and idea, and fact pattern. Okay, oral tradition. By the way, we tend to treat oral tradition poorly. We're like, if it's written down, it happened. If it's oral tradition, it didn't happen. Why is that obviously nonsense? Almost all written tradition comes directly from oral tradition in any case. Secondly, the idea that stuff that's written down somehow doesn't change, stuff that people's in the mind, that it's in people's memory does change, is to ignore the way that history is done in lots of other places. So if you've ever been to parts of the Middle East, in the schools in Islamic schools, young children all the way up to adults memorize the Quran word for word. And some of them learn to kind of sing it in a particular way, and they have a particular honorific that goes along with that. When these kids come out from memorizing it, kids that you would assess of like, this kid's not particularly bright, he's got the whole thing memorized word for word, and he doesn't miss any of it. The human capacity for storing this kind of stuff is pretty good, especially if formulated in a way that things are memorized easily, which is why what you'll see later, creedal formations, are things that are meant to be recorded and kept in oral tradition with a high degree of certainty, right? So you put it in a format like almost a poem. If you read a couple lines from Shakespeare, and they're of iambic, pentameter, metric, and they rhyme, you know that you kind of got all of his words right because they fit the length and they fit the rhyme scheme. So it helps you keep oral tradition in a degree of higher certainty. Okay. In the oral tradition, this is very, very important, but if you look up, and I would encourage you to do it while I'm talking, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. It is formulated in that kind of poetic format of a creed. So this is something that attests to Jesus' death and resurrection, and it's considered in the biblical writing as the earliest material. That creed right there is considered the earliest material that we have. So I'll recommend that to your further study. Okay, and I said already delivered and received, that Paul is giving them the tradition he received. This is very important, and this is historians' metric here. Why do we think that it's early? Look at the language behind it. So when stuff gets translated, sometimes things are lost in translation or you don't know where they came from. The use of certain phrasing or word order or word types or selection helps indicate where it came from. And there's good evidence, historical evidence, that this is from Aramaic, which is what the early disciples were speaking. So when is the origin of the creed dated? And the answer is, from a historian's metric, very soon after Jesus' crucifixion, probably within 5 years. Okay, and the conservative scholars think that's generous. Most most scholars think the crucifixion happened in AD 30. Could be slightly later, could be slightly earlier. Paul's conversion, 31 to 33. Paul leaves for 3 years. As you'll remember, he goes into Arabia for 3 years. Then he comes back and visits Peter and James. And in fact, he says he kind of does it on the down low when you read in the letters that he wrote. Is that he kind of like, not he snuck in there, but he didn't run back into Jerusalem and be like, hey, I'm on everybody's team here. Any thoughts as to why he might not have done that? They should occur to you. But most scholars believe that that's where Paul picked up the creed at that time. Now, it could have been at some of the other churches, but that's where most of them believe it. And the other options are, he heard it right from the get-go in Damascus, which is the reason for possible earlier dating. But either way, he was within 2 to 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Okay. The very latest dating of the creed would be prior to 51, which is 21 years after. In terms of ancient attestation, that is a heartbeat in time. No other ancient sources are that close from flash to bang in terms of when the event occurred to when it was codified, recorded in oral or written tradition. It's just unheard of. So the historian, an honest historian, looks at that and says, this is fantastic material. This is fantastic material. Now, again, all it says is that's what the disciples believed. So it doesn't mean that it happened. But it does mean that we can say with certainty some historically speaking, I'll phrase it this way. Based on those metrics, this is one of the most certain historical facts that we have in history predating the Middle Ages. Like, it just doesn't get any better than this. So again, what ruler are you using? If you're using the same ruler that you're measuring Caesar's commentaries, and you're measuring what happened in Egypt, and you're measuring what the Sumerians said, and you're measuring what goes on in Gaul at the time, and you say whose is historically more reliable, this is a couple of orders of magnitude more reliable than all of those historical things I was just talking about. Okay. The latest, we did that. Okay, biblical versus extra-biblical sources. So inside the Bible, and again, if we're treating the Bible as just another written document, there shouldn't be a difference between biblical sources and non-biblical sources, other than the folks who wrote these believed the facts that they believed the things to which they were attesting. And the other extra-biblical sources didn't believe in the religious interpretation of the things that were being attested here. Okay, but you can't, it is important to note that historians don't do the thing where they say, well, this person believed that Pharaoh was a god, therefore we can't believe what they carved into this stele. Right? We don't do that, because if we did that, we wouldn't believe any history at all. You have to think that people who write things historically at least wrote something that's at least partially true. Otherwise, history is just exercise in futility. Okay. There's a point 2, evidence that demonstrates that the creed existed prior to Paul's writings and was not originated by him, and can be claimed as non-New Testament source. As a result, such evidence includes the terms delivered and received, and there are non-Pauline terms in there. So we won't cover that here in the interest of time, but go back to this chapter in the book and they'll delineate what those are. So here's some important points concerning the creed. Why the creed? It's the earliest material we have. It's very early testimony to Jesus' resurrection. It's probably eyewitness testimony to Jesus' resurrection. They justify that statement earlier in the book. There are multiple testimonies to Jesus' resurrection in the creed. Okay, it's Cephas, Peter, which is the Aramaic, the 12 disciples, more than 500 at one time, James, an opponent for a while, and all the apostles, and Paul. Okay, that's a lot of named eyewitnesses. And the post-resurrection appearances to the 12, to the 500 plus, and to all the apostles are also attested to in this creed. So in terms of legendary accretion, it's very, very early testimony that very, very early on, this is what these people thought happened, is that Jesus rose from the dead. And then, of course, if you look from a summary perspective, from Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13, and 17, when is the origin of the sermons dated? Within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And these sermons are obviously very heavy on the resurrection happening. Important points concerning the sermon: early testimony to his resurrection, possible eyewitness testimony because of the people who would be standing around, and group appearances that are referred to as well. Why are group appearances important? If you're 20 years after the fact, And you're like, lots of people saw this around here in Loudoun County. And someone's skeptical about the claim. All they have to do is be like, who are the people that saw this in Loudoun County? And start asking and be like, oh yeah, Timmy over here said he saw it. You go talk to Timmy. Timmy's like, yeah, I saw it. But this is the kind of thing that you can run down. And so if it's the case that this was fabricated this early on, it was legendary this early on, but they're claiming that these events happened while there are not just a couple of eyewitnesses, but hundreds of eyewitnesses running around, it's really, really easy to disprove. And so the historian's assumption is somebody would have come up and disproven this and recorded it somewhere if it were the case that was unreliable. Okay, written tradition. I think we can make a quick note to this, but all the four Gospels, of course, the Apostolic Fathers, Clement of Rome and Polycarp, and maybe more importantly, they believed it. So the fact that the disciples believed it is, of course, highly relevant to the question of did it actually happen? So to attest to something and to believe it, as we all know, unfortunately, are two different things. To say that you think something is true and to actually think that it's true are two different things. So why do we think that the disciples, because by the way, people die, give their lives for stuff that's false all the time, right? Christians believe that. No Christian says these guys Muslims flew planes into the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001, but they didn't believe that what Muhammad said was true, right? They clearly believed it. But the question is, does their belief have anything to do with the truth of the claims? What's the difference between guys willing to fly their planes into towers and guys willing to be martyred for it in the case of the disciples? What's the key difference?
One is, in the case of the disciples, is they are eyewitnesses.
Right.
So it would be different if you were the third tier, down the road.
Yes.
But if you're the eyewitness and you have a lot to gain from not being killed because that would hurt and be bad, then you would think you would take these. Yeah, okay, for that I made it up.
That's the key point right there. That's exactly right. Okay, so obviously their transformation from we doubt this. Remember how it's reported in the Gospels. Peter and the boys don't come up, and the girls are like, I met Jesus. Peter and the boys are not like, thank goodness, just like we expected. What do?
You're lying.
They're baffled. Like, what are you talking about? And eventually they're like, he did say this was going to go on, but they are obviously blowing this off, right? They're like, I don't know what he's talking about. Yes, sir.
So go back to your point about there was nobody around that wrote opposing views saying, oh, that didn't happen.
Yes.
How do you know that somebody can go back and just erase that?
You don't. What you do, though, is say, you take the historical context at the time. Who was being suppressed and persecuted? Well, yeah, but at this point, the Christians are the ones getting crushed and lit on fire later and all that kind of stuff, right? But ultimately, anybody who's writing from the Roman perspective that says like, yep, this guy, these lunatics were saying this guy rose from the dead. We just pulled the body out of the grave and showed him it was false. That's the kind of stuff that would be more likely to be preserved because it's not being actively suppressed. Now again, it's not a 100%, but it's the way the historians look at it. That's the kind of reasoning that goes on in historical thinking.
So certainly, at the very least, we have the religious or the Jewish leaders saying that Jesus' body wasn't stolen or was stolen. They're not saying that the body wasn't crucified or wasn't dead.
Yeah, so he's jumping ahead. That's later in here on the, was the tomb empty? But this is the point, which is like all this stuff says this would be easy to disprove. And so what we would expect is you've got Josephus writing about this stuff, and we've got early writings that would be roughly contemporary with Josephus or kind of post-Josephus review of what he wrote that would say, hey, yeah, there was another explanation, and it was very clearly the case that's not what happened. They produced the body. But even the counter story is the body was lost. Right. The body's gone. So that's an important point that they hit on later. Okay, so very quickly, I'll run Polycarp, Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, Origen, Origen, all say the same thing. They agree on this. And the important point is what Steve pointed out. The willingness to suffer and die is evidence of the sincerity of the belief. That is a key point. And in fact, in my opinion, I happen to think this is either the most important point or one of the most important points, is that the 12, 11, 10, when you take John out, that everybody who was threatened with death, who could have gotten out of it by being like, oh, nope, it's not true, easy, all you had to do was sacrifice to Zeus, and you were good. All of them went to their death, some of them fairly horrifically as a result. And again, it's the eyewitnesses. If the third or fourth level people did it, maybe they were just fooled. These guys knew, they would have, quote unquote, known better if it wasn't true, right?
So Scott,
Okay, yes, sir.
On the death part, you don't read much about that in the Bible. What historical documents document their deaths that are trustworthy?
That Jesus died?
No, that the disciples were killed in horrific manner.
Yeah, it is certainly a series of tradition that are written by the second and third groups of people, but we'll see some of that in here in a bit. But basically, the church fathers, the early apostolic fathers, are the ones who record some of this kind of stuff, usually by reference of like, he suffered under this, or
Josephus does mention the death of James.
Right.
It doesn't say how, but that he's killed.
right. And then you have, you'll see the sources that we get into here of like how exactly James died. So there's, one that's a little bit more legendary. It sounds like they pitched him off the pinnacle. And then we'll talk about another source very briefly here that says, like, well, they did throw him down. It wasn't from the very top of the temple, but then he lived. And so they continued throwing stones at him. And then eventually a laundry guy hits him with his laundry bat, so to speak. So these kinds of, they're not immediately contemporaneous. But again, in historical terms, one thing I want to encourage everybody in here to realize, you have to realize this. No ancient historian data comes from exactly at the time. It just doesn't exist. So you either quit on history at all, or you ask the question of like, okay, how early was this? How modified was it, etc. And the point here is the sources that talk about the disciples suffering are, they're not 20 years after, they're 100 years after, or they're 150 years after, but they're still, in terms of relative time of record to event, incredibly close compared to all these other historical events we're talking about. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
This session, but I gotta respond to that one
Shoot.
because it's simply not true. I mean, Julius Caesar wrote books. We have his books. We don't have the books that he wrote, but as with the Gospels, we have later copies of them. Cicero was writing about what was happening. We have contemporaneous accounts of all kinds of things written in Roman history.
Yeah. I'm talking about, so we're talking about guys not writing about what they did themselves. So I will agree with that. I'm talking about historians writing about events that happened that were not events that they're not attesting to the event that they were doing. It's not a diary. It's not a journal. Obviously, diaries and journals, if we have them, are contemporaneously written. And technically, all historians.
Cicero, they were writing letters to each other and talking about what was happening.
Yeah, I agree with that. But my point, that factors into the whole formula of, okay, this is what's written that says that they wrote that. Where's the earliest copy that we have of that? And how do we know that these were Caesar's words and not somebody else's words? So I think that we're happy to say things like Caesar's commentaries write this, but Caesar wrote Caesar's commentaries. We have to do more work to say how much of that was Caesar's original writing and how much of it was accreted or changed or whatever else. But I think we're happy to observe it. But in terms of historians, let's say historians writing stuff that they're not concerned with immediately. A historian putting together a full historical picture of events that happened at the time, that this is as close as it gets.
Well, by definition, historians write about what happened in the past.
Yes, and that's right. Exactly. That. And the question is how far in the past. And so what I'm saying is from an historian's perspective, this is extraordinarily well documented and early documented. And that's the point that I'm trying to get across. And they're trying to get across. I'm summarizing their arguments. Okay, we're in I'm going to hit just the high points here in the interest of time. But he suffered his suffering and martyrdom. Here's all the sources that attest to that of the early church fathers. The conversion of James. So you've got the Gospels, you've got the creedal reports, you've got Paul in Acts, You've got Josephus, you've got Hegesippus, and Eusebius, you've got Clement, and because he's quoted by Eusebius. All right, the empty tomb. I'll briefly mention this, the Jerusalem factor. It's what I said earlier. It's just not historically plausible for Christianity to survive and expand into Jerusalem if the body's still in the tomb, because it's just too easy to disprove. All you got to do is produce the corpse. Enemy attestation. This is the one we talked about earlier, so I'll refer you to the comments we made earlier of like the hypothesis was the body was stolen, not the hypothesis was, yeah, we just showed them the body and they weren't listening. Testimony of women, terrible idea from a historian's perspective, which is contemporary, great idea from a historian's perspective because they were not considered reliable witnesses at the time. You don't have ladies be the first people to find them. Now, opposing theories, and this is where the point-counterpoint goes on. Legendary accretion, which is the point we brought up earlier, is the story embellished over time. The story of the resurrection is traced back to the original disciples. That's the important point. So, as we've said before, they could be lying, they could be hallucinating, they could be doing any of those things. But claiming that it developed legendarily over time is to just be historically ignorant. That's not what the history shows, and that's not what the solid history shows. Now, by the way, I want to point this out. When historians look back at Muhammad and his initial companions as well, this is the same standards that we're using there. So people don't deny that Muhammad claims to have written the Quran, or I guess to have recited the Quran. He didn't write it. That he claims Gabriel gave him the data, and that he turned around and recited it. So all of the most important documents in Islam, in terms of history, are the sayings of the actual companions. So after Muhammad dies, an historian starts going around and interviewing the guys and wives of Muhammad who are actually there, and they have a whole collection of works that is of second importance only to the Quran to them, that are basically acts for Muslims. Most historians agree with all the information in there. The difference is nothing miraculous is being claimed other than the Quran itself, which Muhammad says the Quran is a miracle because it's so well written, and the proof that it's so well written is you try to bring to me anything as well written or not well written, as well said as the Quran, and that would be the only evidence you have. To which most historians scratch their heads and are like, we don't think it's particularly well written. But okay, if that's your only proof, fine. So those are religious guys writing about religious facts, but historians consider that all fairly reliable, very reliable, in fact, and they're happy to accept it. So if you're going to treat that as reliable, why wouldn't you treat this as reliable? You have to be fair on both parts. Okay, we've covered Paul and James. And it is true that embellishments occur over time. But saying embellishments occur over time is not the same thing as saying, therefore, this was embellished over time. You have to have some reason for thinking that. Yes?
Just on the opposing theories, I remember on the first class, someone brought up the idea was about what's the proof that the body wasn't buried?
Right.
And what are the documents to support that?
Okay, so this is, to put this back in context, remember I'm walking through some of these arguments. We're not going to have time to do them all, so I want you to see where they sit. All of these questions are in the book, and they're in these argument summaries. Okay, so go look in the argument summary about the empty tomb to see what the data are that these guys are claiming in here. But if I can say to everybody again, you cannot come to a 4-week class on this and get the data at that level. That is exactly the kind of question you should be asking, but you can't get it all in here for good reason. There's too much data. There's too much data to cover in 4 hours. How long does it take you to read this book? For those that have read it, how long did it take you? 4 and 4 hours, right? Okay, it's going to take a few days in total time sometimes, if you're reading it closely, okay, and referencing back and forth. So we're not going to do it all here, but those data are contained in here, and we're hitting it hopefully in time. Yes.
But just briefly, part of the reason the Gospels are considered reliable and are in the Bibles because they're considered reliable to some of the earliest sources, at least the New Testament writings. So to think about it historically, then you need, and plus the religious establishment was saying not that he was tossed in the pit, but that body was stolen from a tomb.
Yes.
And so in order to contradict that, you need to have some other defeater to
Yes.
that existing thing. And at least what I've seen so far from those defeaters is that they're relatively ad hoc.
And that,
Well, the body, they would have just tossed it in this can't be true because they just wouldn't have done that.
Right.
Well, okay, that's pretty ad hoc, but let's come up with some reasonable thing that opposes something that could have been written certainly within 30 years.
yeah, and there's nothing wrong with coming up with another hypothesis, but what does a good historian have to do?
Okay, wait.
Look for evidence for their hypothesis, right? So the point that these guys are making is this is evidence, and which hypothesis does it support? So
Yeah, but
that's exactly
a
right.
really high level answer.
So that's right, and a good point. So I'm gonna skip number 2 because this isn't an objection that most people care about. But if you're interested in it, in a genre critique one, look into number 2. I'm also going to skip resurrections in other religions because to go through this in significant data. Number 1, YouTube has actually done a decent job of this in some places. It's done a terrible job in other places. But we'll give you some references to that here. But basically, there are no close parallels to this in other religions that predate Christianity. It's often claimed by kind of the internet warriors out there. But when you go back and you look at the data, there's simply not there. It's just not true from a historical support perspective. Fraud theory, we'll briefly mention it here on the high points. So obviously one of them is that the disciples lied or stole a body. What's the contributing evidence to that?
They were martyred.
Yeah, they died for their belief. And if you stole the body, do you really want to give it all up in terms of painful death? Someone else stole the body. Okay, that's a better hypothesis, but it doesn't explain Paul, who would have suspected the fraud and who wouldn't convert it because of an appearance. Doesn't explain James, and it doesn't explain the belief of the disciples, which were based on what? The disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead were not based on the fact that the tomb was empty. What was it based on? Seeing it, according to them, right? So even if true, the point they're making is it can only call into question the cause of the empty tomb. Okay, being willing to die for one's beliefs does not verify those beliefs are true. We've talked about that. The claim that a person's willingness to suffer and die for his or her beliefs strongly indicates that the person sincerely thought those beliefs to be true. That's the difference between September 11th and these eyewitnesses versus people who were not eyewitnesses to it. And so they sincerely believed it and claimed to be eyewitnesses. This is an important fact to try to explain. Wrong tomb theory. Even if true, you've got the appearances still. So it doesn't explain. This is where we're getting to the part now of like the wrong tomb theory explains an empty tomb, doesn't explain appearances. And that's a key historical factor. So in terms of explanatory power, it is a less preferred hypothesis. The testimony of the gospel is that the tomb was empty, but convinced no one but John. Mary concluded the gardener stole the body, right? So this was a fairly early hypothesis. It was Mary's idea. And the disciples didn't believe on seeing the empty tomb. So this was not particularly convincing evidence to them, necessarily. It's the appearances that got them. Okay. And by the way, burial by Joseph of Arimathea indicates that the tomb location would be known. Okay. I'm going to skip the apparent death theory because if you've been a Christian for more than 17 seconds, you've heard a sermon on this one. And this basically comes from Strauss. There's some Germans that was really popular to write about this in the early 20th century. And this is hand waving. I totally recognize this hand waving. And so I generally don't do this, but in the interest of time, this is a set of historical ad hoc critiques that have been thoroughly debunked, that were brought up without anything other than speculative theories, which were complete, not only unevidence, but contra-evidence by the actual data. Okay, psychological phenomenon. This is an important one, okay? I think this is actually something that we ought to ask about. We'll skip down to 2, the hallucination theory, okay? But typically speaking, hallucinations happen on an individual basis. Lots of people don't hallucinate the same things. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that lots of people can see and attribute to it wrongly, right? Lots of people see an eclipse. Almost everybody got the reasons for the eclipse wrong back in the day, okay? But the fact that they saw an apparent eclipse, lots of people saw it, meant that it wasn't one person's subjective experience. It was lots of people's subjective experience, which indicates, in the same way that more witnesses indicate something wasn't subjectively misinterpreted or not seen, that in a hallucination event, you don't have matching between lots of people. Again, what a hallucination also doesn't explain empty tomb, doesn't explain Paul, who is completely opposed to this idea, doesn't explain James, who was not in that mindset at the time, and just too many variances for the historian to swallow it. Men and women, individuals and groups, friend and foe, hard-headed Peter, soft-hearted Mary, indoors and outdoors, so it's not like, it was swamp gas and reflecting off of a weather balloon near Area 51. Okay, not once, but many times over 40 days. Delusion theory, again, you've heard that one covered before. I won't redo it here. Vision theory, interesting, a little bit ad hoc, but the vision theory is very closely related to hallucination theory. So the counter evidence to a vision theory is the same to that of the hallucination theory. That is to say, if it's vision in the vision genre, it's refuted above. If it's objective, if the visions were objective, then Christ is risen. If you're not following that, what it's basically saying is compare vision, that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead corporeally, but rather that he appeared in a vision. Some people say that as like, I don't care, okay, fine. Jesus didn't bodily rise, but he arose in some other way and appeared as a vision. This is meant to talk about that particular theory. This is more religious theory than a secularist theory right here. We'll move to, well, actually, let me go to the next one here. So all of this is in the same vein, epiphany, and then combination theories are just combinations of those same ones. Let me sample this. So on page, what page number do we have here? Page 231, I want to point out to you subparagraph H. So as you're going through the book, and I would encourage you, by the way, after this class, after this discussion, to go through the book, read the book, because you want to be familiar with the actual data to it. Discrepancies in the gospel accounts of the resurrection make the story dubious. Okay, this one comes up with some frequency. What does it call into question? At most, the inerrancy of the records of the inerrancy of the Gospels itself. Historians don't turn around and say, "Hey, here's a legendary, Caesar or Josephus or somebody claims to have seen this obviously crazy, event that we don't believe was actually what happened in modern times." Okay, and so as a result, everything Caesar wrote, or everything Tacitus wrote, or everything Josephus wrote is obviously bunk. That's not what the historian does. The historian looks to try to separate the legendary from the stuff that's kind of better attested or that we believe actually happened. So why is the minimal facts approach valuable here? Other works of antiquity are not rejected when discrepancies exist. So remember what I was saying, fair balance? If you're going to reject for this reason the gospel accounts, you're rejecting almost all, if not all, these other historians. Differences in the Gospels indicate they were independent accounts, which is important. I wish DJ's gone. If you're I'll say this quickly, I've covered this occasionally in here. If you're a policeman and you pull over 4 people in a car and you break them out of the car, what's the first thing you do before you start taking statements? Separate them. What happens if all the statements match word for word? The conclusion is it's a fabricated story that they rehearsed ahead of time, right? The fact that there are discrepancies in the story attests to its veracity. Now, if the discrepancies are too great, what do we think they're doing? They're all making up different stories about what happened, right? So there is basically a ratio, a confluence of key facts and variance that you would expect from eyewitnesses that is key attestation, both historically and forensically, to the veracity of the statement being made. Okay, biased testimony. Hey, you can't trust the Gospels because they're written by Christians. Paul, James, that's the opposite of the case.
I guess going back to combination theory, I did have a question.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Because the way they kind of get rid of it is like, if you look at the probability, it's so improbable that all this combination happened. When we talk about probability, I guess the best way to think probability is the probability of evidence given that the event happened.
Yeah, so I'm going to boot the probability argument to next week for those that are willing to do so, only because unless I misunderstood the temperature of the room last time, did anybody bring tomatoes or stones? I'm pretty sure people are going to throw stones at me if I address that question today. All right, so we will do that one next time in great depth. And because I've given a promise, right? Okay. Yeah, we covered biased testimony. So I would like to also point out 5 and 6 on this. So we're at subparagraph. We're on biased testimony. We're talking about whom it was, whether the sources were biased in favor of one or the other. These are important logical points. And why do we talk philosophy in here? Recognition of certain philosophical truths and logical methods help us to think. So you in the same way you should have structure if you're doing construction, in the same methods. In the same way you should have structure if you're doing math. You should have structure when you're reasoning about anything, including religion and skepticism. The genetic fallacy is an informal fallacy that says, because I say how something arose, therefore it's false. That doesn't follow logically. It's just not, one doesn't lead to the other. The ad hominem fallacy says, well, this guy's a real jerk, or this guy believes X, therefore he can't be. That's like saying, well, we can't believe relativity, or what Einstein wrote about relativity, because he obviously was in favor of the theory. It's clearly nonsense. That's not how we do stuff. We don't turn around and say, hey, we can't believe the guys that are looking through the telescopes, because all of them believe in, whatever particular model of the universe they believe in. Obviously, they're not going to find any evidence, but scientists find contravening evidence all the time to the normal system of belief in there. So it counters what they believe themselves. Okay. I want to, in the interest of time, because it's 10:05, I wanted that to be a sample of the kind of arguments and how well they're supported in here. Again, it's 30 pages long just to summarize the arguments. But for folks who are looking for just the facts, man, the stuff, what I wanted to outline for you here by the end of this class, and so here's the last 10 minutes of the formal 4 weeks of this class. This will continue for those that are interested starting next week, and we will go as long as people want to. But in summary, for an ETS format, here are the key points. Key point number 1, be fair. Okay, so however you're going to treat Caesar's commentaries and Plutarch's lives and Josephus's writings and ancient Egyptian steles and Babylonian steles and all that kind of stuff, use the same standard. So point 2, when you use a common standard, and what I mean by a common standard is the same standard that as much as you believe any historical ancient fact, if you use that same standard, you would believe the minimal facts. Okay? What are the minimal facts? The minimal facts do not include Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? You might think that's the case, but when you look back through the minimal facts, none of them are that Jesus rose from the dead. What are the minimal facts again? Empty tomb.
Belief of the apostles.
The disciples believed that he rose from the dead and that they saw him rise from the dead, or saw him risen from the dead. What else? Death. He died by crucifixion.
Paul's life was changed.
Paul's life and James's life were changed, but Paul's life particularly. And what was the last kind of plus one?
Empty tomb.
Empty tomb. Okay. So those are the facts. Now the question is, use a common standard and then list the hypotheses, ranging from well accepted to fringe, right? Hypotheses. List the hypotheses and then select by standard. Okay, use the same standard you would use for anything else. And if you use those standards, the one that has the best explanatory power that matches all the facts is that the reason these guys said what they said, the reason the historical evidence that we have, both oral tradition and written tradition that's out there, the reason the attestation we have by opposition is there, the reason that Paul's and James's lives were changed from being strong opponents to being strong supporters best fits the fact pattern that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Okay, now, I will bring up one last piece in there as entree to next week, which is, I think, at the very end here. Give me 1 second, please. All right, look on the left side of the screen. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, okay? This is Hume's objection. We'll start there because ultimately, you need to be ready to correct me next time. So I'm going to work on the assumption that you're coming from a Humean skeptic's perspective. If that's not the case, A, tell me now if you know. But if not, that's what I'm going to talk about.
Parts of it. I mean, I wouldn't
Parts,
say-
okay. Fair. Well qualified, sir. I do the same thing. Like, I don't believe everything the person said, but key portions of it are important. Yes, okay. So what the authors of this book are going to say is extraordinary evidence does exist. Okay, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. You do have extraordinary evidence here. What is extraordinary? Out of the ordinary. In terms of historical data, you have way out of the ordinary support for this. So ask yourself this question. Take on the skeptic. We've got a genuine skeptic in here. He's going to be sitting in this. The rest of us try to be as objective as we possibly can. Be the skeptic and ask yourself the question, if it's actually the case that a miracle occurred. Okay? So I don't believe miracles. I'm going to be a skeptic now, right? I don't believe miracles occurred. I don't have any good evidence to believe. I've never seen a miracle. Nobody I know sees a miracle. If there was a miracle, surely it'd be on YouTube. Like, I just don't believe miracles occur. Okay. Somebody comes around and says, all right, look, let me tell you something. It's possible, like we've got an actual possibility that a miracle occurred at this time in history. The question we want to ask ourselves is, what evidence would we see if a miracle actually did occur? So if it's the case that Jesus actually rose from the dead, what type of evidence would we expect? What volume of evidence would we expect? What kinds of things would we expect to observe in the historical record? And the point of the authors here is, you've got exactly that. You've got exactly what you would expect if Jesus actually rose from the dead. That's an important note. And by the way, the requirement of extraordinary evidence is reciprocal, and this is where Bayes comes into it, and good probability theory comes into it. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why is this evidence there? And not just one bit of evidence, but all these different lines of evidence. Why are they there if he didn't rise from the dead? Okay, so you have something extraordinary. Extraordinary evidence requires an extraordinary counter to it. Okay, so there's extraordinary evidence for Jesus rising from the dead. What's your equally extraordinary counter to it that says that's not the case? So if you're going to adopt the standard in one direction, you have to be willing to adopt the standard in the other direction if it's the case that this is extraordinary evidence. And I think that I'm safe in saying that historians will agree that this is extraordinary evidence. Yes, sir.
What you just said, I think, excludes the possibility that we just say we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
I think there are better explanations, but
This is a little bit disingenuous of me because I'm going to bring this up at the end, but I did say it's a transition the next time. So all of that you're thinking in your mind and broiling in your heart right now, save it for next time because we will absolutely. You start with the floor next time after brief introductions. Okay. Now, of course, no Christian book would be complete if a presentation of the gospel didn't occur. So let's see subparagraph E for a presentation of the gospel after that. All right. I've left myself, as you predicted, far too little time to summarize all this. But let me outline for you why we're doing what we're doing here today. It's reasonable. It's eminently reasonable for Christians to ask the question, why do I believe what I believe? It's not fair for you to say, skeptic, you should be a Christian. And my reason for being a Christian is that my parents told me it was a good idea and that I grew up in the church. That's not an adequate answer to a skeptic. And it's not an adequate answer to your own conscience and mind. It shouldn't be. You should question what you believe about bacon and about religion, about driving and about the way you raise your kids, about how schools work and about how governments work. If you're not asking questions, you're sheep. And not the good biblical kind of sheep, the bad kind of sheep, okay? And so, or maybe goats, we'll say. So the goats, they're just not well accepted in the Bible. And if you've ever met a goat, you know why.
Just really quickly, don't forget the genetic fallacy in that just because you learned this from your parents doesn't mean it's false.
That's also right as well. Okay. So I want to bring this up to say this is what we do in Solid Ground. I know the probability theory side is about the worst that we get in here. It was very mathy and philosophical. Usually we're not that bad. But I wanted you to know that I wanted you to have a sense and a taste that we do think about things at this level. So if you're interested in continuing a discussion at that level, and what we'll do next time, by the way, is I spent this entire time in lecture, which I hate. I don't like doing it, but in the desire to cover some of the material and demonstrate its the specificity, we did this for this class. Next time, floor is y'all's. So bring your questions, bring your objections, and we're going to slog it out. But note that when you do things in a good dialectical method like that, it takes 5-10 times longer than it does for me to just sit here and spew it at you. I'm an okay speaker, but I don't speak as well as these guys write. You want to see it well done? Read the doggone book. All the data are right there, okay? But you want to sit here and talk about it, and let's hammer it out. And by the way, if you haven't realized what, I'll say it this way, that you're going to chafe at this one. Look at what God has given us for this class. He has brought into the class, for those who are Christians who believe this, if not, you've randomly arrived here through a co-location of deterministic forces bent at the very vectors of the Big Bang to bring you here for this highly improbable event. Someone who can represent the opposition theory, and as you've heard this gentleman speak, he's no intellectual slouch, and he's not ignorant. Okay, so we have someone here who is willing to sit and talk with us. So I'll offer this to two different sides of people. For people, the one that I care about maybe most. For those of you who want to know, is what I believe really true, or am I taking stuff on faith? Here's somebody who's occupying mentally the position that you kind of should be occupying if you're asking that question honestly. So you'll get to hear another mind ask these questions. For those of you who have already convinced yourselves, or hopefully more properly, are properly convinced that this is true, this is going to be a laboratory in how to engage, hopefully respectfully and lovingly and kindly, with someone who has a view different than yours, and you'll get to see how the two different sides of the lines of evidence stack up. Okay, so this is a rare opportunity. I would commend it. And by the way, a huge thank you for coming and doing this. And by the way, and continuing to commit to come to a Sunday school class as an atheist, like huzzah. So we appreciate it. If you haven't, come say thank you to him, because he's the reason that we're doing this kind of stuff. And if you felt irritated or bothered by this one, go blame him. It's his fault. Thank you. I commend you all for this. If you're in this class, it meant you cared enough to challenge your own beliefs or understand it. And I commend you for that. It is very, very rare to do so. Lots of people sat in the debate. 99% of them wanted to hear a Christian give an overweening argument to an atheist to support what they thought already. You're not doing that. You came in here and said, show me the facts. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for that. And if God is a God of truth, it means the truth's on God's side. And that's an important point to know as well. Thank you all very much for coming. It's been a pleasure here. Welcome you back next time as many of you want to come. And thank you again in particular.